Bonaparte was a man of contradictions. He was a revolutionary and a tyrant, a conqueror and a liberator. At first, a dramatic success, while ultimately a spectacular failure, perhaps his only consistent feature was that he did nothing by half measures. Once he had decided upon a course, he pursued that course to the utmost, whether it was seeking to rule France, deciding to unify Europe, or pursuing Josephine. Napoleon was a man of passionate convictions. Except when it came to the Jews. Here, Napoleon was on one hand a liberator who freed Jews across Europe, while on the other hand, he took away many of the rights Jews had newly won in the Revolution. Across Jewish communities, the debate raged. Was Napoleon a savior to the Jewish people, or was he a dangerous fraud whose ultimate goal was the erasure of Jewish identity? Throughout the Middle Ages, Jews were never allowed to be part of a common political body. Instead, their rights and duties were governed by individualized legal arrangements with provincial nobles. In France, this system had led to a division not only between Jews and Christians, but within the Jewish community itself. Under the system of privilege, or private law, France had allowed Sephardic Jews exiled by Spain during the Inquisition to live in tightly regulated trading enclaves in southern port cities like Marseille. In essence, Sephardic Jews bartered access to their merchant connections in the Ottoman Empire, along with a high tax burden, for the right to live in relative peace, while still maintaining some connection with Catholic French society. Ashkenazi Jews, by contrast, lived in the north and east, particularly in Paris and along what is now the German border in Alsace and Lorraine. Owing to their poverty and connections with neighboring communities in Prussia and Austria, Ashkenazi Jews had been subject to repeated expulsions from France throughout the medieval and early modern periods. They were also restricted to a limited number of professions, chief among them money lending and the small-scale peddling of goods. The result was that the Ashkenazi community was more insular than the Sephardi community, and mingled with French Catholics as little as possible. Though all Jews were held as a class apart by the French Christian world, and frequently vulnerable to extortion and blackmail by French Catholic merchants. Then came the Revolution. On September 27, 1791, the French National Assembly passed a groundbreaking decree, the admission of the Jews to the rights of citizenship. The decree was remarkably simple and comprehensive, stating in its entirety that the National Assembly, considering that the conditions necessary to be a French citizen and to become an active citizen are fixed by the Constitution, and that every man meeting the said conditions, who swears the civic oath and engages himself to fulfill all the duties that the Constitution imposes, has the right to all of the advantages that the Constitution assures, revokes all adjournments, reservations, and exceptions inserted into the preceding decrees relative to Jewish individuals who will swear the civic oath, which will be regarded as a renunciation of all the privileges and exceptions introduced previously in their favor. At a stroke, the Revolution had declared the entire privilege structure obsolete. The overall transformation of the Jewish role in society was immense. No longer would Jews be considered a separate people. Now they were as French as anyone else. To those of us who have lived our entire lives in a modern, centralized state system, it is hard to grasp the full effect of this decree. Writing decades later, Nachman Sirkin, the prominent socialist Zionist leader, explained the revolution's transformative effect. The ghetto walls were broken, releasing the Jew into the world as a factor in civil life. The millennial Jewish condition of servitude came to an end. The wound that had been festering within Jewry since the fall of Jerusalem began to heal with the fall of the Bastille. Yet emancipation on the surface obscured conflicts buried deeper within French society, both between Jews and Gentiles, and within the Jewish community itself. The problem stemmed from the complexity of French administration before Napoleon. Like many countries in the 1700s, Despite the attempts of recent rulers to centralize, the French system was still largely a patchwork of confusing and overlapping regional legal frameworks, further complicated by divisions in civil and ecclesiastical legal authority. Many of these divisions had existed for centuries, and though the revolution had overthrown the Estates General, the decade that followed was chaotic and plagued by conflict. Despite the terror of Robespierre and the guillotine, the revolution never secured the stability necessary for lasting institutional reform. Jewish emancipation was likewise controversial even in revolutionary circles. Although some, like the schismatic priest Henri Gregoire, advocated strongly for full emancipation, for most others, including Robespierre, Jewish rights were an afterthought. As Max Nordau put it in his speech to the First Zionist Congress, the leaders of the French Revolution emancipated the Jewish people only for the sake of logic. Emancipation also raised substantial practical questions related to civil and political rights, and there were important divisions within the Jewish community about the trade offs between the benefits of new rights and the dangers of assimilation. Jews, after all, are not a monolith, and France in particular was home to large communities of both Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jews. One of the most important issues was the question of religious intermarriage. Rabbis in the tight-knit, insular Ashkenazi communities refused to recognize marriages between Jews and Christians, while the less persecuted and more international Sephardi rabbis allowed mixed marriages. As a result, many Jews supported the Girondins, a faction within the revolution that advocated for retaining substantial decentralization and consequently opposed Robespierre, at least until he sent their representatives to the guillotine. On the eve of Napoleon's ascension, Jews' status was ambiguous. They were liberated, and yet, with nothing concrete to replace the privilege system, their rights and duties remained unclear. In the wake of an incomplete and chaotic revolution, pressured externally by the War of the Second Coalition and internally by divisions within the revolution, Napoleon faced a daunting task: secure the borders and then consolidate the legal regime and turn France into an actual nation, rather than a confederation of feudal estates. His response to France's Jewish question has to be viewed in the context of that larger goal. Yet, even before seizing power on the 9th of November 1799, Napoleon had developed a strong reputation towards the Jews. During the War of the Second Coalition, fighting for the revolutionary government, Napoleon's army swept across Italy and North Africa, liberating the Jews in the name of religious freedom. Acting on his own initiative, Napoleon first freed the Jewish ghetto of Ancona in 1797 and continued with those in Rome, Venice, Verona, Padua, and Malta. Napoleon's reputation among the Jews grew rapidly, and when the Ottoman Empire entered the War of the Second Coalition against France, Napoleon was sent to North Africa to invade Egypt and Syria. Rumors swirled within the Jewish community that Napoleon would soon liberate the Jews of the Holy Land and allow the Jewish people to return to Ottoman Palestine. It was not to be. Ultimately, Napoleon's invasion stalled at the Siege of Acre, owing partly to disease, and in a strange twist of historical irony, owing partly to the participation of the prominent Syrian Jewish Farhi family in organizing the defense of the city. The same family would be repaid for their patriotism by being falsely accused of a murderous conspiracy in the Damascus affair 40 years later. If you would like to learn more, check out our video on the Damascus affair. Despite the failure of the Siege of Acre, Jewish liberation followed in the wake of Napoleon's conquests and was buttressed by the expansion of legal rights embedded in the Napoleonic Code. So great was Napoleon's impact that it spurred widespread debate within Jewish communities. Hasidic rabbis argued about whether Napoleon's liberations signaled the coming of the Messiah. Jewish parents across Europe named their children after the emperor, and many came to compare him to Cyrus the Great, the Persian emperor who authorized the Jewish return to Israel and the rebuilding of the Temple of Jerusalem following the Babylonian exile. Despite his liberation of the ghettos, Napoleon's relationship with the Jews was more complicated than it at first appears. To understand why, we need to look at his actions after seizing control of the French government. In 1806, Napoleon convened the Assembly of Notables and instructed them to form a Grand Sanhedrin as a legal advisory body to answer 12 questions concerned with the assimilation of Jews into French Catholic society. The questions were presented in an ordered list. 1. Is polygamy allowed among the Jews? 2. Is divorce recognized by Jewish law? 3. Can Jews intermarry with Christians, or does the law allow for Jews to marry only among themselves? 4. Will the French people be esteemed by the Jews as strangers or as brethren? 5. In what relation, according to the Jewish law, would the Jews stand towards the French? 6. Do Jews born in France consider it their native country? Are they bound to obey the laws and customs of the land? 7. Who elects the rabbis? And 8. What are the legal powers of the rabbis? 9. Is the election and authority of the rabbis founded on law or on custom? 10. Is there any business in which Jews may not be engaged? 11. Is usury, money lending, to their brethren forbidden by the law? 12. Is it permitted or forbidden to practice usury with strangers? The questions were focused on identifying areas in which Jewish practices should be brought into line with French Christian majority practices, including the problems of polygamy and intermarriage with Christians, issues where France's Ashkenazi and Sephardi communities had differing traditions. Ashkenazi rabbis banned polygamy and intermarriage both, while Sephardi rabbis permitted intermarriage and occasionally allowed polygamy, owing to its permissibility in the Islamic regimes where many Sephardic Jews had historically lived. Arrangements that could persist under the medieval privilege system in major port cities like Bordeaux, but were incompatible with Napoleon's civil code. Lastly, Napoleon sought to clarify the extent to which money lending was permitted under Jewish law. In early 1808, the Sanhedrin sent its advice to Napoleon, and in March of that year, Napoleon issued the infamous decree, reimposing some limitations on Jewish freedoms. The restrictions were intended to homogenize Jewish and Catholic behavior, but often imposed a disproportionate burden on Jews. One example is the decree's approach to money lending, historically an area where Jews were permitted to operate despite church bans on money lending, largely due to the state's need for a functioning credit market. The state still needed the market, but Christians were increasingly moving into the business, and Napoleon's experience with the French Revolution meant he was deeply skeptical of the historical debt load imposed on the rural and working classes. As a result, the infamous decree imposed a 10-year ban on Jewish money lending activity in rural precincts east of Paris, including the conquered territories of the Holy Roman Empire, and forgave or reduced substantial proportions of debts that Christians owed to Jewish lenders. Unfortunately, most money lending was not controlled by large credit houses. It was handled locally, at the town level, by much smaller businesses. Since Jews in Europe were banned from land ownership, universities, and many other professions throughout the Middle Ages and early modern periods, money lending was one of the few business opportunities available to rural Ashkenazi Jews. Not by choice, but by law. The result was to punish those law-abiding Jewish families in the name of assimilation. On the other hand, when combined with Napoleon's abolition of the ghettos and the extension of full citizenship rights, the decree did promote assimilation by encouraging Jews to seek work in fields of employment and study that were newly available to them, although diversification of employment would likely have followed naturally from the removal of restrictions, even without the money-lending moratorium. All of this poses a conundrum. Given the rather pointed questions posed to the Grand Sanhedrin, and the restrictions of the infamous decree, What were Napoleon's goals? How can these restrictions be understood in light of Napoleon's widespread liberation of the Jewish ghettos? Historians still debate Napoleon's exact opinion of the Jews and the motives for his conflicting actions. The debate is made even more complex by Napoleon's own statements on the matter. In a March 1808 letter to his brother Jerome, at the time of the infamous decree, Napoleon laid out his opinions about the Jews in apparently clear terms. I have undertaken to reform the Jews, but I have not endeavored to draw more of them into my realm. Far from that, I have avoided doing anything which could show any esteem for the most despicable of mankind. So much for Napoleon the Liberator. Here he sounds like a clear anti Semite. But this story is not so clear cut either. For one thing, it has to be understood in the context of Napoleon's later statements, most famously one made to his personal physician while he was in exile on the Isle of St. Helena. Here, Napoleon sounds again like a liberator and egalitarian revolutionary. My primary desire was to liberate the Jews and make them full citizens. I wanted to confer upon them all the legal rights of equality, liberty, and fraternity as was enjoyed by the Catholics and Protestants. It is my wish that the Jews be treated like brothers, as if we were all part of Judaism. As an added benefit, I thought that this would bring to France many riches, because the Jews are numerous, and they would come in large numbers to our country, where they would enjoy more privileges than in any other nation. Without the events of 1814, most of the Jews of Europe would have come to France, where equality, fraternity, and liberty awaited them, and where they can serve the country like anyone else. So, how do we resolve these conflicting statements? One convincing answer, favored by many historians, is this. Despite the influence of the revolution on his thinking, and an authentic sympathy for the plight of the Jewish ghettos, the Jews were secondary to Napoleon's empire building project. His primary domestic goal was always the centralization and standardization of state power in order to fuel the expansion of the French Empire. As a result, Napoleon sought to balance two competing concerns: maintaining the loyalty of Europe's Jews to harness their assistance in expanding his empire, balanced against the diplomatic need to not move too quickly while he reconsolidated power after each wave of imperial expansion. The Sanhedrin and Napoleon's statement to Jerome are best viewed in this context. Napoleon was being somewhat disingenuous in his letter. You see, the letter was political. Jerome was not only Napoleon's youngest brother, he was also the relatively new King of Westphalia, and Westphalia was a new client kingdom of France with its own history of Jewish discrimination. The local population was less than thrilled about the expansion of the Napoleonic Code. Perhaps even more importantly, Napoleon was trying to retain his tentative détente with Russia, now ruled by Tsar Alexander I, who was famously anti Semitic. The Tsar understandably feared further westward expansion by Napoleon, and had protested to France regarding the liberation of German Jews on Russia's western border. Similar protests had been heard from Austria-Hungary, whose own policy towards the Jews was one of qualified assimilation and regeneration through encouraging conversion to Christianity. The infamous decree sought to blunt the thrust of these protests by bringing French policy more in line with the policies of the rest of Europe. Yet even here, Napoleon did not fully commit. An early draft of the infamous decree included a requirement that 1/3 of all Jewish marriages would be intermarriages with Christians, to encourage visible assimilation by the Ashkenazi Jews who lived closer to Austria and Russia. This requirement never saw the light of day. It was abandoned without being published, let alone implemented. Infamous or not, the decree never came close to approaching the restrictions on Jews imposed elsewhere in Europe. Napoleon's supposed anti-Semitism was only skin deep, a tool employed in the service of empire building. At the same time, while his belief in equality was genuine, it was secondary to his desire to modernize the state and expand his personal empire. Napoleon was a real friend to the Jews, but he was also conscious of the need to minimize internal dissent and mobilize continual popular support for his military campaigns. Tied as it was to Napoleon's conquests, the status of Europe's Jews rose and fell with his successes and ultimate failure. Unfortunately for the Jews, Napoleon's ascendancy proved short lived, and rulers east of the Rhine were less than thrilled with having the Napoleonic Code imposed on their governments. With Napoleon's ultimate defeat at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, he was finally permanently exiled to the Isle of St. Helena, and the revolution's impact on the rest of the continent was dramatically reduced. The resulting peace of the Concert of Europe extended Jewish liberty to exactly one location, the newly formed country of Belgium, which was split off from the Netherlands and had a long history of religious toleration. Elsewhere in Europe, Jews' situation rapidly deteriorated. In Germany, the Hep riots would break out soon after Napoleon's final defeat and the ouster of his brother Jerome. In Russia, Alexander I continued restricting Jewish rights, a policy that would be continued under his son, Nicholas I. Only in Austria-Hungary, owing to the influence of the Enlightenment rationalist Clemens von Metternich, would Jews' situation east of France remain relatively stable. Napoleon's project of European unification and the Jewish liberation that followed would never be fulfilled. And in the decades that followed, virulent anti-Semitism would rear its ugly head in ever-strengthening manifestations. Alright, now for a quick channel update. Now that the Modern Jewish History series is well underway, we're going to start introducing some content with more general appeal. This series is not going away, and there are a few videos in the pipeline already, including one on the idea of Jewish assimilation and another on the Dreyfus Affair. But those will alternate with a new series on political philosophy. The first video in that series will be a deep dive into Machiavelli's Prince, which is already scripted. We also have a couple episodes planned in that series, which have relevance to both contemporary worries about authoritarianism and historical Jewish issues, including one on Karl Jasper's approach to German guilt after World War II, and others on Hannah Arendt and Albert Hirschman, which deal with methods of authoritarian control and propaganda. Keep an eye out for those as we enter the new year. As always, thanks so much for watching, and if you liked this exploration of Napoleon, please help us fight the algorithm by liking, subscribing, and checking out our other content.